Hi, so I'm Peter Kramer. I'm up from Providence. I'm a professor at Brown and a writer of books for general audiences. And you will not hear much from me tonight because you're in for an extraordinary treat. Dr. Raza is just a wonderful lyrical speaker. I was at an event this summer with the historian David McCullough, who was meant to be in conversation with another eminent writer. And the writer asked one question, David McCullough talked for the rest of the evening, and was marvelous. And I'm expecting something maybe a little along these lines too. I'm just looking forward to hearing Dr. Raza. I do want to say how I know her, which is not a happy story, except that, maybe in one regard, which is I had a close relative who was ill. She was involved in her care, in his care. And she is just an extraordinary caring clinician that comes across in the book and is absolutely true in life. The last time I saw this cousin of mine, I was leaving his bedside in a community hospital miles from New York. He probably no more could be done for him. He was dying of cancer. And I heard that Dr. Raza had gotten hold of a car and was on her way to the bedside, even though very likely nothing could be done. And I think that's just, the kind of doctoring we would love to get and don't, and that we very much admire. So I think what we're going to do is start by asking Dr. Raza to read some excerpts from this book to give us a setting, and then we'll see what we talk about.
Thank you, Hillary. Thank you to Harvard Bookstore. Thanks to all of you for coming. And many thanks to Dr. Peter Kramer. I've been his admirer since 1993 when his book came out, Listening to Prozac. Such a beautifully written book, and so it shifted paradigms, I think, in the field, and also full of wonderful clinical stories. But unlike the great David McCullough, my rule of thumb about speaking is that a good speech should be like a woman's dress, long enough to cover the subject but short enough to remain interesting. So I don't think I'm going to let my dress get too long. It's almost providential that on Thursday, the most credible, the most knowledgeable, the most well-respected voice in science in the country, the director of NIH, Dr. Francis Collins, who was involved actually he led the Human Genome Sequencing Project, so no voice can have more authenticity than Dr. Collins. He came out in Time magazine on 24th October, this Thursday, describing his vision for the future. In the very first paragraph, which I encourage all of you to read, in Time magazine, Dr. Collins says that life expectancy for a baby born today in the United States has risen by 47 years. So at the turn of the century, life expectancy was 47 years. Today, it is 78 years. And a lot of this, of course, is owed to antibiotics, but the other thing is that decline in mortality from cardiovascular diseases is by 70%. And in the same sentence, Dr. Collins says, and a drop of 1% in mortality annually from cancer. So 70% decline in mortality from heart disease, 1% annually for the last 2 decades in cancer. So if we continue at this 1% rate to catch up to cardiovascular disease mortality, it's another half a century, 1% at a time. So I thought I'll begin this evening by reading the first 2 pages of the epilogue of my book. My older sister Amra, my brother Tasneem, and I took our mother shopping in Buffalo one sunny summer afternoon in 1988 when she was visiting from Karachi. Tasneem, a cardiac surgeon at Buffalo General Hospital, had already performed hundreds of coronary bypass surgeries. And his group was leading the charge in heart transplants in Western New York. It was impossible to walk 50 feet in the mall without being stopped by one of his cured patients. Of course, at home, Tasneem was less eulogized, we siblings refusing to let him develop the God complex. We teased him mercilessly at family gatherings. My sister Sora would innocently ask, "Aps, what do you call two cardiac surgeons looking at an EKG?" I would reply deadpan, "A double-blind study." Thankfully, no one likes a joke better than Tasneem, who would gleefully address the pediatrician, my sister Atya, radiologist, my sister Sora, and oncologist, me. "Statistically speaking, 9 out of 10 injections you ladies give are in vain." He loved calling us by an acronym that we reserved for some of our ex-boyfriends. "Hello, sisters, what is the NATO group up to?" NATO being our code word for no action, talk only. Or he would ask us sweetly if we had heard of the mechanic working on the heart surgeon's motorbike who said, "So doc, look at this engine. I open its heart, I take out the valves, repair any damage, put them back in, and when I finish, it works like new. So how come I make 40,000 a year and you get 40,000 a month for doing the same?" And the surgeon replies smugly, "Try doing it with the engine running." As we were returning home, my mother asked the question I had been dreading. "Well, you've been in Buffalo for almost 10 years. I've never met any of your patients. Why are heart patients doing so much better than cancer patients?" She had put her finger on the heart of the matter. Tasneem and I had often had the same conversation. Our conclusion? Heart doctors recognized that the only effective treatment was prevention and early intervention. The equivalent of cancer in heart disease would be a heart so severely damaged that the only possible treatment would be a transplant. Advanced cancer is like this end-stage heart disease where only extreme heroic measures have the potential for saving lives. "So why don't you find ways to diagnose cancer early also?" my mother asked. She was pleased to hear that devoting my life to understanding and treating MDS, which is a pre-leukemia, was my attempt to do precisely that, catch the leukemia early. "Well, then I'm glad you're living in America," she said. "You will have an easier time convincing your colleagues to alter their attitudes. In Pakistan, the system would be impossible to change in one lifetime." So the point I wanted to make was that Dr. Francis Collins, it's a beautiful article, I urge all of you to read it, but starkly points out this difference between cardiovascular mortality and cancer mortality. And the answer is staring us in the face, early detection. And we will have much to discuss about means of early detection and how to prevent cancer in a few minutes. But I'll just read one more passage. I don't want to test your patience too much, but one of the reasons for writing this book for me is to bring the patient back front and center into every conversation. Because I somehow feel that we have drifted a little away. We have become so involved and obsessed with wanting to cure disease that we have forgotten about the illness. And what's the difference? The disease is something that doctors diagnose and treat. But illness is what a patient experiences. Not only disease and illness, we have moved far away from recognizing the difference between cure and healing. And somehow, especially in cancer, the rule of medicine, which is primary and above all other rules, is first do no harm. And we seem to be getting away from it because the therapies we are developing only seem to help patients with advanced cancers, at least only a fraction or a subset of patients. And the majority suffer all the toxic physical side effects and financial toxicities, and we are hurting them for what? So, in order to bring the patient front and center, what I did in this book is I tell the stories of 7 patients. One of them is my own late husband who dies of cancer. But then I go back to the families many, many years later and ask them to cast a backward glance and try to ask themselves what they would do differently. So I think a very most moving part of the book for me is what the patients' families now say about how they, in retrospect, view this dizzying, disorienting drama that unfolded so rapidly that they didn't have time to think. So I'll just read a passage or two from here and then we can have a discussion. In 2005, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross published her final book on grief and grieving, in which she suggested that families go through the same 5 stages of denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, not necessarily in that order, as do patients given the diagnosis of a terminal illness. The problem turned out to be more complicated, however, as the bereaved suffer emotional bedlam in unpredictable installments, rather than an orderly, stage-defined, specific progression, at all times attempting to readjust their place in a new world devoid of their loved one. Being part of the disquieting, vexing, confounding action as the disease flamed and burnt its way with primeval savagery, all the characters seemed larger than life, observations seemed disproportionately significant, every question, no matter how inconsequential, worthy of an answer. The necessary issue ultimately relates to choice. And when the choice involves life and death situations, both the potential risk and individual responsibility demand intense emotional, psychological, rational, spiritual input. Was some choice made under intense pressure, caught in the whirling vortex of a rapidly progressive, unmistakably fatal disease, the right one? Would clarity come from looking back years later? But then hindsight can also pose a problem, as retrospection tends to interpret events in rosier terms, to bring intellectual order to the impossible practical disorder of life. Consider the famous Robert Frost poem, The Road Not Taken, which addresses this question of choice examined in hindsight. The last most famous lines of this poem: "Two roads diverged in the wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference," appear to define the essential characteristic of the intrepid, bold, self-reliant, daredevil, quintessential New Englander. The ideal American who goes against the grain, exerts individuality by choosing an unusual, risky, unknown, seemingly untrodden path. The key to the poem lies in the middle, where Frost describes the two roads. Being entirely covered with fallen leaves, they were basically indistinguishable. It is only when the poet looks back years later and reflects on the events of his life, ages and ages hence, does he decide that he made the best choice, since that has made all the difference. Of course, it made no difference at all. But hindsight allows the poet to bring order to randomness, as if the decisions that were made the difference, were rational, logical, and evidence-based. Although it posed the risk of rationalizing irrational events, I asked family members of patients we have met in this book to cast a backward glance on the events. I had them read what I have written about their loved ones, about the gaping holes in our scientific understanding of cancer, about the draconian measures offered as palliation or treatments, about our failures as a society. Knowing all of that, I asked them how they might have reinterpreted or come to view the choices that were made differently. My hope is that given the benefit of reappraisal, re-examination, the information could be methodically re-reviewed. Decisions made under intense pressure can be calmly and systematically sifted, reconsidered, questioned, alternate possibilities imagined. From this perspective, the what-if questions might finally be addressed, especially as related to what pain and suffering could and should have been avoided. What can be prevented in the future should such situations arise again and affect the living? Understanding what choices would be altered, how to balance external contingencies with inner compulsions. The hope is reliving tragic situations is that it brings a modicum of relief to acknowledge the randomness of life, to concede that no matter how hard one tries, it is impossible to make any sense of the profound anguish their loved ones went through, to allow one to face the unintelligibility of disease, to face death, to accept that the only answer is that there is no answer.
I want to ask you about what it is to live your life as a doctor. These stories, and this is, no spoiler alert here, these 7 stories are all stories where things go badly. It's, if you're giving 90% of the injections you give are futile and you're working with a disease that does not have a lot of spontaneous remission, what is that life like as a doctor's life?
Thank you, Peter. First of all, I want to just clarify that this is not a doom and gloom book. It is a forward-looking book. It is a very optimistic book because I'm very, very much looking forward to a better outcome for patients in the future. But I think you're absolutely right that while the 7 patients I describe, I go into the granularity of their suffering and pain and grief and all the things that they lived through. But on the other hand, there are a lot of living patients whose stories are remarkable as well that are interspersed throughout the book. So everything, every bad prediction did not come to pass. And there are people living beyond expectation for 20 years with their cancers. There are patients who give testimonials to that. But on the whole, of course, I'm constantly dealing with a disease which generally has a fatal outcome. And I am walking patients to their deaths all the time. And how does one lead that kind of a life, especially when even after 20 years of doing this practically on a daily basis, it wasn't until I shared a bed with a cancer patient that I really realized the depth of pain and the intensity of the anguish that is involved in the life of a cancer patient. So no matter how much we see in from one side of the bed, standing on the other side of the bed can still dramatically alter your perceptions. And for me, one thing that happened with Harvey, my late husband's cancer, was that everything around me was still the same, but my eyes changed forever. And that perception was very different suddenly.
So I think this is one of the great virtues of the book, is the granularity and directness of the look at suffering. It's very much true to the experience, and probably many people here had this experience of being with a person who is just in terrible pain and going downhill. Where do things stand now? We have this statistic that we're making this imperceptible progress against cancer of 1% decrease in mortality a year. Not nothing. But we read in the paper every day about personalized medicine, about chemicals that are specially crafted to fight a particular patient's cancer. What is that about? What is that disparity in viewpoint?
Yes. This really bothers me, and one of the reasons that I was really forced to write the book is that somehow there is a perception in the public as if things are hunky-dory in cancer, as if great advances have been made. I want to set the record straight with some statistics to begin with. We are curing today 68% of cancers which are diagnosed. 68%. How are we curing them? That's the problem. Slash, poison, burn. Surgery, radiation, chemo. My question is why? Why after 60 years are we still using these? We boast of godlike technology, cutting and pasting DNA, yet our treatment for cancer is Paleolithic. It belongs in the Stone Age. And what about the 32% people who we are not curing because they are diagnosed with advanced disease? Their outcome is no better today than it was 50 years ago. So despite hundreds of billions of dollars in research, 4 million papers published in cancer, where are all the new treatments? Yes, mortality from cancer, as pointed out by Dr. Collins, has gone down by 26%, but not because we came up with some brand new treatment. It's because, number one, anti-smoking campaign finally started to pay off in the last 2 decades. And number two, early detection. Early detection by what? By mammography, colonoscopy, pap smears, PSAs. Again, tests that were developed 50 years ago. But they have brought down the mortality. So the writing is on the wall. Everybody knows that, somebody gets diagnosed with cancer, the only good news is always, oh, it was caught early, so they're going to be fine. That's the only good news you hear about cancer. Why aren't we doing that? Why are we not paying more attention to early detection? Why are we banking on mammography? And colonoscopy is taking a tube and putting it into somebody's gut and looking by eye. In this day and age of technology, how gross is that? We should be aware. So my point is that we keep using those old things and we keep saying, we were over-diagnosing with mammography, or we were over-treating, some prostate cancers we shouldn't have. Yes, because the technology we've been using could not differentiate between an aggressive, potentially lethal, life-threatening tumor and something benign that could go on for 30 years and didn't matter to take it out. We need better technology, but today the resources are so unevenly divided. Only 5% of any funding goes towards measures of early detection. 5%. Why? So I'm not saying that all the present research should stop. Of course not, because we have patients who have cancer today. We have to worry about them. There may be many people in this room who have cancer. If you don't have cancer, you know someone you love who had cancer. All of us are basically 1 degree of separation from cancer today. 1 in 2 men and 1 in 3 women will get cancer. It's not something that happens to someone else. It will happen to 1 out of 2 of us. So the point I'm making is, why are we relying on age-old screening technology to look once a year? If we can see something, we'll say something. Otherwise, everything is hunky-dory. No, I'm saying we should be treating the human body like a machine and constantly monitoring it for the appearance of disease, perturbed signaling pathways, biologic markers, biomarkers. We should be using the latest implantable scanning imaging technology to determine where cancer is appearing. And I make a prediction all the time that in the next 10-15 years, you'll see that not just cancer, but all of healthcare is going to go towards prevention rather than active treatment.
So I think one thing that's very convincing about the book is really a critique of drug companies who manage to get drugs past the FDA that have benefits, but when you look at the benefits, it's to a very small number of people, and they, after exposing many people to the drugs, those who benefit are living a few more months, not all of them, they're months. So, where should we be going? I think that's the issue. Now, Dr. Raza has a tissue bank, I think she can tell you about, but why a tissue bank? What are we looking for? What is that future going to look like?
Wonderful question. Sounds like I planted these on you. But actually we never talked about.
I did read the book.
Peter's absolutely right. Do you know that today, of the drugs that are brought in experimental trials to a cancer patient's bedside, this is the staggering statistic. 95% of clinical experimental trials, 95% fail. The 5% that succeed and are FDA approved should have failed because they're only prolonging life of patients by months at the cost of hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now, why are we at this point where 95% drugs fail? I think it's unfair to just blame pharmaceutical companies because their stated objective is to make a profit. But academic centers shouldn't be making a profit. Yet every academic center is run like a business. So it is not fair, in my opinion,
The academic centers.
yes, it's not fair, in my opinion, to only blame the pharmaceutical companies. The point is that why are all these trials failing? Well, one thing is cancer is very complicated. There's no question about it. Think of it. Early cancer, if we detect it, 68% we detect early enough to be removed or to be treated by chemotherapy or radiation therapy. But the 32% where the disease has advanced, the problem is every time a cancer cell divides into two, it makes DNA copying errors that lead to new mutations. That means there are potentially new cancers every time a cell divides into two. Treating cancer as one disease is like treating Africa as one country. Even in the same patient, cancer at two different sites is not the same. The cancer of the lung that goes to the liver has a completely different biologic manifestation, different metastatic potential. So it's very complicated. The second problem is that we are not even studying human tissue. We are trying to replicate this incredible monstrosity using a very reductionist conceit and trying to replicate it in petri dishes and in animal models. Now, I'm constantly being misquoted, and then I start receiving hate mail from everybody. I'm not against animal models at all. Animal models are very good as biologic tools and definitely must continue to be used. The only thing I'm against is using animal models for drug development, which means you can't treat a mouse with a drug and if its cancer disappears, you can extrapolate that information tomorrow into patients. You can't. That's all I'm criticizing. In fact, it was Norbert Wiener here in 1940s in Harvard who said, the best model for a cat is another cat. preferably the same one. You can't have human diseases replicated and studied in animal models. It's like saying, I will open the brain and find consciousness. Of course not. It's too complicated. So, the most important reason for our failure, besides the fact that cancer is a very complicated disease, the second important thing is, in one word, hubris. Arrogance, our reductionist conceit that if enough molecular biologists put their mind together, we will be able to unravel every abnormal signaling pathway inside a cancer cell and reverse it. This is like saying, I'll cure aging tomorrow. You may be able to do it in 1,000 years, but not anytime soon. So what do we do immediately when we are faced with such a confounding adversary? To deal with it, we try to catch it early before it has become so hugely complicated, before it has mutated, transformed, metamorphosed into something completely unmanageable. This is what I'm saying. So I think the reasons for failure that you point out for all these drugs you wanted me to say is one of the reasons, as I said, is complexity. Another reason is studying the disease and trying to develop drugs and models that are not faithfully representing the human disease. And in order to study the human disease, we need human tissue. Now, this is where it helped me to be an immigrant, by the way. Yes. Because I came to this country as a fresh graduate in 1977. And started working immediately at Roswell Park Cancer Institute before I started even my residency. I was interested in acute myeloid leukemia, and within 7 years, it was very clear to me that this disease, acute myeloid leukemia, is so aggressive and so complicated that in my lifetime, we will not find an answer to it. So I pinned my hopes on trying to find this disease early in its pre-leukemic stage and try to intercept and stop it from becoming acute leukemia. So that pre-leukemic state is called myelodysplastic syndromes. And in 1984, I started to study patients with myelodysplastic syndromes, to treat them, follow them as they developed either leukemia or a worsening MDS. And as I said, it helped me to be an immigrant, because had I gone to school in this country, I would have started to make a mouse model of the disease. But I was a naive Pakistani who didn't know any better, and I thought, well, I have to study my patients, so might as well save samples. And in 1984, I started banking blood and marrow samples and germline DNA, buccal smears, T cells separated, a CD34 stem cell separated from the marrow. In 1984, I started. Today, I have the largest tissue repository in the world collected by a single oncologist. Not one cell in this repository has come from another physician. It has over 60,000 samples from thousands of patients. Every vial has a story for me, because to this day, I do 5 to 10 bone marrows myself every week. There are people in this room on whom I've done marrows. And every cell is precious, because I know the pain that those patients have gone through. So where's my answer? I've been doing this for 35 years. Why don't I have an answer? I seem to be painting myself as Miss Wonderful, who knew pre-leukemia and collected all this tissue. The problem is that in science, everything, as you know, goes in fashionable things. So first we were thinking, okay, we'll find the new oncogene in the 1980s. It was all about oncogenes. That didn't come to pass. Then in the 1990s, we'll choke off the blood supply. Angiogenesis was the big thing. It cured a lot of mice, healthy mice running around all over the place.
Also here at Harvard.
Yes, also from here. And then did nothing when it was brought to the bedside of cancer patients. Then we were all waiting for the human genome to be sequenced. And that got sequenced. Now it's 20 years since that happened. And again, that just keeps showing us how much more complicated things are than we expected it to be. We were thinking we'll find all the mutations, develop the magic drugs, the magic bullets, and go and cure every disease. Didn't happen. So it's time to recognize that you see, one of the issues is that it's not we don't have a solution, we are not even willing to see the problem properly. It's Einstein who said that if I have 1 hour for a problem, I will spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes about the solution. So the first step is to take off our blinders and look at the problem in all its entirety and with honesty. And the problem is that we are no better today than we were 50 years ago in dealing with complicated and advanced cancer. And even in curing the 68%, it kills me that we are using such terrible therapies. It's not fair. It's, as somebody said, it's like taking a baseball bat and hitting a dog to get rid of its fleas. That's what bone marrow transplant, that's what immune therapies are like. We shouldn't be doing this. We should have more humane, more compassionate answers. And that will come with what? So that's why Peter led me into this description of the tissue repository. Why don't I have an answer? Well, because technology was not developed, but now we have all the technology. We didn't have all the tissues. Now we have all the tissues sequentially saved on thousands of patients who have traversed the natural history of their disease from pre-leukemia to leukemia. Now, if we can study these samples using the panomics, which means genomics, proteomics, transcriptomics, metabolomics, all these wonderful technologies that are available, if we interrogate the samples sequentially, longitudinally, in a thoroughly detailed manner, we should be able to understand and identify the earliest footprints of how cancer really began at a biologic, metabolic, genomic level, all of these things together. And once we have those identifications, then we'll ask the question, well, why did some healthy people develop MDS or pre-leukemia? Why did they develop? Was there a genetic predisposition? Just like BRCA genes for breast cancer and ovarian cancer and putting people at high risk of those, there must be many genetic things or many biologic things making us, whether it's exposome or exosome. And so once we identify who are these people, for example, if 2,000 patients who developed a pre-leukemia with a chromosome 5 damage, look at their germline DNA. What kind of specific polymorphisms were they born with? And if we identify that 80% had this variant in such and such gene, then we can go to healthy banks of sequences and look to see how many people are already there with this kind of polymorphism and are they getting anything. So what I want us to imagine something for tomorrow is something like this. You go to sleep at night and your bed sheets scan you overnight for the appearance of the first cell. How is that possible? Well, remember that a cancer cell, as soon as it begins, it proliferates faster than normal cells, which means it has to start attracting nutrition to itself, which means it makes blood vessels, new blood vessels. So the area becomes hot because there's lots of blood going suddenly to one area. That can be picked up by scanning and imaging techniques. Imagine standing in your shower and your shower scans you. Imagine that you sit on the toilet and a fit loo takes part of your urine and analyzes it for the presence of colorectal cancer. Or you brush your teeth with a toothbrush that takes part of your saliva to do this. Or women wear a smart bra just for 2 hours a week, but the bra is fitted with 200 microsensors to detect changes in temperature. And that can detect breast cancer more accurately and more frequently than yearly mammograms. You know that these are not fantasies. This is not a pie in the sky. These are all actual advances that are in various stages of development. The smart bra is undergoing a clinical trial in California right now. So a lot of stuff is happening. I'm not saying that no one is paying attention to early detection. All I'm saying is that more resources are needed to accelerate the process and to stop wasting all the resources on end stage therapies which add few months to lives. And the last statistic I want to give before I stop is that in 9.5 million Americans who were diagnosed with cancer over a 12-year period, the study was just released in October last year, 9.5 million cancer patients, 42% became completely financially ruined by 2 years. What kind of society is that? Where is all this money going? I'm asking the question. Don't say it's going to drug companies only, because it's not. The hospitals are also charging the money. Everybody is in it for the business, and the only ones who are suffering are the patients. How is it possible that we are not curing them? We are hurting them, most of them, because 80% or 70% won't respond at all, and financially ruining them. It is obscene, it is untenable, it is unsupportable. The country is going bankrupt because of healthcare, and it has to stop. So what I'm saying is that until and unless we look at everything through the prism of human anguish, we will not be shaken out of our complacency. What are we doing to people here? Cancer patients are suffering in more ways than one, and we have to do something about it, and let us not just develop the technology, but first do no harm, protect the patients.
So I think that plea is, I think, representative of the book. The book, Siddhartha Mukherjee said this is a cri de coeur, and it is a cry from the heart from someone who lives with the problems and who is developing the solutions. At the risk of being a tease, I would say that over dinner we talked about some of the work that's coming out of Dr. Raza's lab, and it's very particular. It's very narrowly focused, but I think very interesting and promising. I think we should stop there and get questions, just so we have a sense of what people are hearing and what their concerns and interests are. Yes.
I was caught by your comment about we are failing as a society and how we care for the patients. And I was wondering how another society, and how do we stand apart from other societies?
Very good question. Here's the problem. The whole world looks to America for leadership. This is the standard that we are setting. Nobody has a better solution. We are supposed to provide the solution. And I think we are failing as a society. We are failing humanity. We are failing our patients. I think there's a crisis in oncology. Yes.
I would like to ask a question. As a woman who nursed her mother through pancreatic cancer, 84-year-old mother, in 2003, at the end of 2004, I found my own highly aggressive breast cancer. And I agree with just about everything you've said. And I knew the first time my mother took chemotherapy that it was not for her. But I could not convince my scientist brother of that, nor other relatives. Now, one of the questions I have for you, my cancer, I think, came on partly because of stress, but I think it also came on because of environmental factors and the precipitous weight gain I had writing a doctoral dissertation, which made me more prone to breast cancer. I went through quite a treatment regimen. I was lucky to have access to Herceptin. And that's why I agreed to go through the treatment that I went through. But I know that people in my mother's condition are really failed by the treatments that you are talking about.
Why don't we stop with that? I think we have
Okay, but
I think we have the kernel of the question
What
in it,
about
because other people are
the
going to want to
environmental
ask as well.
conditions that are
Right.
causing the cancer?
First, let me say how sorry I am to hear about your mother and what you are going through. And all our sympathies are with you. And this is the main reason for us to be collected here, to help individuals like yourself. I'd like Dr. Kramer to answer your question about stress and all those things. What do you have to say about its role in disease?
Oh, I'm going to say something a little off to the side, which is not an answer to this, which I have to say, I'm a psychiatrist. Listening to Dr. Raza, you know, we are jealous in psychiatry of some of the bad shape that cancer treatment is in. That in cancer, you have all these terminal patients for whom there is no treatment. And so you have a natural cohort of volunteers for experimental treatments, people who are willing to try treatments with a 5% success rate, say. In psychiatry, for all the criticism that there is of what goes on in psychiatry, for the very common ailments like depression and anxiety disorders, we have fairly good treatments. I know you'll read online and this and that are just you know, placebos with side effects. But my last book, which I spoke about here, Ordinarily Well, sort of addresses that issue directly. But the result is, it's, you know, it's sort of, not only are there no ordinary volunteers, it's not even clear it's ethical to just, you know, people would have to really be well informed about foregoing available treatments to, you know, to take these treatments. But yes, I mean, you know, it's not just depression that's multifactorial. That's part environment, part psychology, part genetics, part early experience, and part, you know, ongoing biology. It is cancer also,
Yeah.
and that cancer is very much one of these mixed biopsychosocial diseases. But that word biopsychosocial is extraordinarily ill-defined.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't really know how to tease apart, and partly because we don't know how to tease apart what things are. You know, it's very hard to know what they are likely to respond to.
Yeah. And about the environment, I must add that you can lead the most pristine life. You can have the best lifestyle and eat well and live in the healthiest environment. It's not going to protect you from cancer. Because the majority of time, while there is of course a component of environmental exposure, majority of time it's a random event. That the DNA makes a copying error and that cell just survives and takes off. But it's a, sorry.
No, I just want to emphasize something that you said earlier. One of the wonderful things about this book, which is also one of the horrible things about reality, is the Darwinian evolutionary nature of cancer. That it really is the case that because these cells are figuring out how to live, that you can have a treatment that's very good for, you know, most of the cells you're carrying, and then the cells that remain are finding a way to do fairly similar damage. And it's
Yeah, the few select cells that survive somehow, very few, will then start to grow, and the fitness landscape where they find the perfect soil, the seed finds the perfect soil in which to take off, that's just waiting to happen. But one thing I was going to say was that many people ask me, so Dr. Raza, the things you are proposing, they're going to take forever to change. But I say that things can happen and change overnight. You know how? Because we are living in a capitalist society, and this has its own very good points. Think of this. It cost about over $2 billion to sequence the first human genome completely, and it took 15 years to do that. Within 20 years, it's now costing a couple of $1,000s and a few weeks to do it. So we've gone from 15 years to a few weeks, from over $2 billion to couple of $1,000. This is what competition can do. So all I'm saying is, imagine that pharmaceutical companies are going into a proposition where they know their chance of success is 5%. 95% chances they will fail, their drug will fail. Yet they are ready to put $2 billion into developing this drug because they know that FDA has lowered its bar for approving a drug to a benefit of 2.5 months in survival only. So if their drug can show 10 seconds longer survival than 2.5 months, the drug will be FDA approved, they can make billions for the next 20 years. So that's why it's worth it for them to invest. But what I'm saying is, if we set a new goal where the chances of success are more than 5%, and we incentivize that goal financially, everybody and their grandmother will be rushing to that goal and things can flip around very quickly. So I'm not at all pessimistic that it will take 50 years. No, we just have to change the mindset. That's the important thing. Stop going after trying to kill every last cell. That's what our strategy is in cancer right now. Give the patient as much horrible treatment as you can, and then we have developed all kinds of fancy molecular techniques to identify 1 in a billion residual cells. So we are doing so much to identify minimal residual disease. Why not turn things around and go for minimal initial disease? And because no one is immune from cancer, not children, not elderly, we need to simply monitor everyone from birth to death for the appearance of cancer. How can we do that? Implantable devices, chips. I'm working with biomedical engineers at Columbia, Dr. Samuel Sia. He already has the M chip FDA approved through the company Opco. And the M chip, men can at home simply prick their fingers and have 1 drop of blood into the chip. It's microfluidic, something that Elizabeth Holmes failed to do. Sam Sia is one of the top names in the country for microfluidics. So this, you just drop 1 drop of blood into the chip, and it comes with a little device. You enter the chip in it and it reads your PSA. So men sitting at home can constantly monitor their PSA as often as they want. I'm saying if I find the biomarker for leukemia or pre-leukemia, 1 drop of blood, you can do that. So for every cancer, if we find the right proteomic or by whatever metabolomic markers we come up with, we can have a barcode of these things on the chip that can easily be testing you at home on little devices. It's not a pie in the sky. I'm saying we can simply financially incentivize a new goal, and given our capitalist society, we will be competing so fast for it that we can turn the paradigm in no time. There are lots of people wanting.
Should we take a few more questions, or are you?
Hillary is going to decide.
One more question, then I have a special request after the one question. Why don't we do right in front here?
I just want to follow up on how you, what are the pressure points for making this change in paradigm, this way of thinking, and develop the technology? It doesn't seem to be happening spontaneously.
Yes.
So are there some mechanisms or suggestions or things people
Yes.
do that would help advance it?
Yes. The last, I think, sentence of my book is that I have been saying the same thing since 1984. I keep using different weapons to say it. I give grand rounds, dinner lectures, breakfast talks, tumor boards, I podcasts, I appear on NPR, I appear on television. Now this is my latest assault on the field. Somebody has to listen, and we just have to keep educating, making people aware, doing everything possible to bring this to the public's attention. And I think once the public's opinion turns and they start, every cancer patient starts asking their oncologist, why are you giving me this drug? When the chances that it will hurt me are 80%, and for 20%, 2 months improvement in survival and me getting financially ruined, I don't want to take it. If you start asking these questions, then I think we can have things change immediately. I wish I had a glib answer to give you, but all of us have to keep trying.
Priorities at NIH and what they are funding?
I mean, ultimately, it's going to be a commercial thing, I think. NIH can say all they want, but until the public opinion turns, until there's something in it for me, for the people who make the money in this country, it won't happen. So I think that all of these things working together have to somehow matter. Why have we found ourselves painted into such a corner that even the decisions I make for my patients are not decided by me? They're decided by a panel of experts who have come up with these guidelines that if a patient presents with pancreatic cancer, this is the first line of therapy. When they fail that, second line of therapy, and this is the third line. Now, if I don't offer exactly that, I'm opening myself to legal challenges. The patient can sue me tomorrow that you didn't offer me what the experts recommended. Well, what evidence did the experts have to make those guidelines? Very little. But what can they do? They have to somehow bring order to method to this madness. So I think it's a very difficult situation. I don't have easy answers. I've been trying to say this for years. My commitment to early detection goes back to 1984. So, but I think there has to be a groundswell of support for the idea. Let's take one gentleman. He's very anxious. Yes.
You're the boss. Yes.
There are biological markers for cancer. Why aren't there biologic markers for something like depression or schizophrenia?
I think we're going to hold that for a different evening. I think we want to talk about Dr. Raza. I appreciate the question. You can come up to me. I know there are many more questions. I will say Dr. Raza talked recently at the Asia Society with Dr. Siddhartha Mukherjee, the Pulitzer Prize winner, cancer doctor who works with her, under her. And somewhere in there you recited the end of a Tennyson poem that had me in tears, and since I like to cry in public, I just wonder if you would, before people come up to have books signed and have a word with you, if you would do that again.
No. Well, thank you. As you know, many people in this room know I love poetry. So this is, before I do that, can I do a brief Emily Dickinson? Suddenly that came into my head. I measure every grief I meet with analytic eyes. I wonder if it weighs like mine or has a different size. I wonder if they bore it long or did it just begin. I cannot find the date of mine, it's been so long a pain. I wonder if it hurts to live, and if they have to try, and whether, could they choose between, they would not rather die.
Thank you. I think we can stop here.
Okay.